I am Carmen, 32 years old, and somehow I am still healing from the wounds inflicted by my own family. As a successful financial crime forensic accountant in Chicago, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. For 2 weeks, my sister and brother-in-law decided not to tell me my mother was in the hospital dying. Finally, a family friend called me. I drove through the night for 14 hours and arrived when she only had 1 hour left to live. My sister and brother-in-law were blocking the hallway. What my mother whispered to me in that room changed everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to relatives who constantly underestimate your worth. The rain beat mercilessly against my windshield as I sped down the highway toward Atlanta. 14 hours. That is how long I had been gripping the steering wheel since Ms. Loretta called me. My knuckles were white and my chest felt empty. My mother Shirley was dying, and my sister Yvonne, along with her husband Derek, had kept it a secret. They let me sit in Chicago reviewing audit reports while the woman who gave birth to me was fading away in a hospital bed. Growing up in Atlanta, I always felt like an outsider in my own home. My childhood bedroom painted pale pink at my mother's insistence. Even though I preferred green became my sanctuary and also my prison. From elementary school through high school, I always got perfect grades and joined honor societies. I thought perfection would help me get the love that Yvonne received so easily. But that never happened. Yvonne was the golden child. A perfect daughter who stayed close to home, married a wealthy white man, and attended a prestigious megachurch. And I was the outcast who moved away to build a career they never understood or respected. I pulled into the hospital parking lot at 3 in the morning. The glaring fluorescent lights of the emergency room entrance blurred through my tears. I handed my car to the valet and dashed through the sliding glass doors. The cold hospital air hit my face, but I did not slow down at all. I rushed past the nurse's station on the 4th floor, the sound of my stilettos echoing on the lobby floor. And there they were, standing outside the intensive care unit like two bouncers at an exclusive club. Yvonne wore a perfect black dress, looking as if she had already been styled for a funeral. Derek, her white husband, stood next to her in a perfectly tailored suit. When Derek saw me, his posture stiffened. He stepped right in front of the heavy wooden door of room 412, blocking my path. I stopped breathing for a second. The audacity of this man standing between me and my mother was suffocating. I told him to step aside. My voice was completely calm, but my whole body was shaking with anger. Derek looked down at me with the condescending smirk he always wore. He told me to lower my voice because I would stress my mother out. He crossed his arms over his chest and said I had no right to barge in here after abandoning the family. He called my forensic accounting career a cute little hobby. He said Yvonne was the one taking care of everything and I only came here to ruin the peace. Yvonne stepped forward, dabbing her dry tears with a tissue. She told me I was so selfish. She said I always had to make everything about myself and mother was resting very comfortably. She told me to go sit in the waiting room until they decided when it was appropriate for me to go inside. I stared at my sister. Even now, as our mother was taking her last breaths, Yvonne was turning this into a power play. She wanted to control the narrative just like she always did. I looked back at Derek, a white man who married into my family and suddenly thought he had the right to dictate my place in it. I told them I was not asking for permission. I took a step forward, but Derek placed his large hand on my shoulder, pushing me back. He told me I needed to calm down. He used that measured, calm tone designed to make me look like an unreasonable, angry person. It was the exact same tone he used at family dinners when he made subtle jokes about my independence or my single status. I swatted his hand away. I told him if he touched me one more time, he would leave this hospital in handcuffs. I reminded him that I am a financial crime investigator, and I do not take orders from a failing private equity manager. Derek's face turned bright red. He took another step, trying to use his height to intimidate me. He told me I was a bitter woman and completely unwelcome. He said the family did not need my drama right now, and mother had already made peace with everyone who actually mattered. I did not have time for his fragile ego. Out of the corner of my eye, I looked through the narrow glass panel of the hospital door. Inside the dimly lit room, I could see the monitors. The green line on the screen was dropping to a dangerous level. The steady beeping was slowing down painfully. Every second I wasted arguing with these two was a second I lost with my mother. A sudden rush of pure adrenaline coursed through my veins. I no longer cared about being polite. I did not care about keeping the peace or pretending we were a happy family. I stood my ground and pushed hard into Derek's chest with both hands. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on the floor, and hit the wall. Yvonne gasped and grabbed his arm, screaming my name in a shrill voice. I grabbed the heavy metal handle of the door and pulled it open. The smell of antiseptic and sickness washed over me. I burst into the room, letting the door slam shut behind me, cutting off the angry voices of Yvonne and Derek. The sound of the heart monitor was the only thing echoing in the quiet space. I walked toward the bed where my mother lay, fragile and small, completely unaware of the storm brewing outside the door. She slowly opened her eyes and looked right at me. I stepped closer to the edge of the bed. My mother's breathing was shallow and uneven. Her skin was pale, and her eyes, usually so full of strict judgment, were now cloudy with exhaustion and fear. When she saw me, a faint flicker of recognition crossed her face. She weakly lifted her frail hand, gesturing for me to lean down. I knelt beside the bed, bringing my ear close to her dry lips. Her voice was nothing more than a fragile rasp. She told me she was sorry. She said she had been wrong about so many things, and that Yvonne and Derek had lied to her. My heart pounded against my ribs. I asked her what she meant, but she shook her head slightly, saving her limited strength. She reached under her thin hospital blanket, and her trembling fingers found my hand. She pressed something small and cold into my palm. I closed my fingers around it, feeling the jagged edges of a tiny brass key. She pulled me even closer until I could feel her faint breath on my cheek. She whispered that they took the estate. She said they made her sign papers she did not understand, and now the legacy was gone. I felt a cold chill wash over me as the forensic accountant inside my brain started connecting the dots. Before I could ask any questions, she gave my hand one final weak squeeze. She told me to find the red Bible in her master bedroom. She said there was a false bottom inside the box it sat in, and that I needed to take the documents and stop them from destroying our family name. Her breathing hitched, and a sudden look of panic flashed in her eyes. I held her hand tightly, telling her I was right there and that I would handle it. She looked at me one last time, and a single tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek. Then her eyes drifted closed, and the grip on my hand went entirely slack. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor suddenly shifted into one long, continuous, high-pitched tone. The green line on the screen went completely flat. For a second, the entire world seemed to stop spinning. I stood there staring at the woman who had brought me into this world, feeling a complicated mix of profound grief and lingering resentment. I did not even have time to process my emotions. The heavy wooden door swung open and Yvonne rushed into the room with Derek right behind her. As soon as Yvonne heard the flatline, she let out a piercing, theatrical scream. She threw herself across the bottom of the bed, sobbing loudly and begging our mother to come back. It was a flawless performance designed specifically for the two nurses who had just run into the room to check the machines. Derek immediately stepped in to play his part. He wrapped his arms around Yvonne, pulling her back with a look of manufactured sorrow on his face. He looked at the nurses with sad eyes, thanking them for doing everything they could. He told them it was just so tragic and that his poor wife was completely devastated. I stood quietly in the corner, watching their sickening display of fake grief. Yvonne did not shed a single real tear. Her shoulders were shaking, but her face was dry when she looked up at the medical staff. The attending doctor walked in, checking the monitors and shining a small light into my mother's eyes. He sighed softly and clicked his pen. He announced the time of death as 3:47 in the morning. He offered his condolences to the family and quietly ushered the nurses out of the room to give us some privacy. The moment the door clicked shut behind the doctor, Yvonne's loud sobbing stopped instantly. She stood up straight, smoothing out the wrinkles in her expensive black dress. She looked at our mother's lifeless body and let out a heavy sigh, as if dealing with a minor inconvenience. She turned to me and said it was finally over and that we had a lot of arrangements to make for the church community. Derek walked slowly over to where I was standing. The fake sadness on his face had completely vanished, leaving only that familiar cold arrogance. He leaned in so close I could smell the stale hospital coffee and expensive cologne on his breath. He kept his voice low so the nurses outside would not hear the absolute venom in his words. He told me I was going to pack my bags and go back to Chicago by tomorrow night. He said the funeral would be a pristine family affair, and they did not need my dramatic presence ruining their carefully planned memorial. He warned me that if I tried to make a scene or challenge his authority, he would make sure the entire megachurch and all of our relatives knew exactly what a terrible, ungrateful daughter I had been. He said my mother left everything to Yvonne anyway, so there was absolutely no reason for me to stick around and beg for scraps. I looked away from his smug face and down at my mother. I did not say a single word in response to his threats. I did not need to argue with a man who was already digging his own grave. I just stood there in the quiet room, feeling the sharp edges of the small brass key pressing into the palm of my hand. The funeral service earlier that morning was a blur of expensive floral arrangements and hollow condolences. By the time we arrived back at our family estate for the repast, the sprawling brick house had already been transformed into a networking event for Yvonne's megachurch congregation. There was no quiet mourning or shared grief to be found anywhere. Instead, there were catered silver trays of hot appetizers and pastors in designer suits discussing church politics and commercial real estate investments. The string quartet playing softly in the corner of the grand living room made the whole thing feel much more like a high society gala than a memorial for my mother. I stood near the edge of the room holding a lukewarm cup of coffee, just watching the sickening spectacle unfold. Yvonne was holding court by the massive stone fireplace. She was wearing a custom black lace dress and a wide-brimmed hat, soaking up the attention and sympathy of every church elder who walked by. Derek stood right beside her, shaking hands and actually handing out his business cards to anyone who seemed to have money to invest. It was incredibly disrespectful, but no one else in the room seemed to notice or care. I tried to stay out of the way, but Yvonne spotted me from across the room. She excused herself from a conversation with the head pastor and walked straight toward me with a cold, hard look in her eyes. The chatter in the room began to quiet down as people noticed her sudden movement. She stopped a few feet away from me, making sure she had a large enough audience to witness whatever she was about to do. She spoke loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear every single word. She told me she was glad I was still here because we needed to discuss the living arrangements immediately. She said since she and Derek were moving into the estate full-time to manage the property, my old childhood bedroom was going to be repurposed. Derek had always wanted a state-of-the-art home gym, and my room had the best natural light on the second floor. She crossed her arms and told me I needed to go upstairs and clear out all my belongings by the end of the day. A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over our side of the room. I looked around and saw several of my aunts and cousins watching me with highly judgmental eyes. My Aunt Valerie, who had always favored Yvonne, scoffed loudly. She stepped forward and said I should be grateful Yvonne was even letting me stay for the dinner after my long absence. She said I had abandoned this family years ago to chase dirty money in Chicago, and that I had no right to act surprised that my room was being given to the man who actually took care of my mother when she was sick. My cousin Marcus chimed in right after agreeing with Valerie. He muttered that I was always so ungrateful and selfish, just showing up when it was convenient for me to make an appearance. The whispers started spreading through the crowd of church members. I could feel the collective disapproval of the community bearing down on my shoulders. Yvonne smiled a tiny, triumphant smile. She was waiting for me to explode. She wanted me to yell and cause a huge scene so she could play the fragile victim and have her church security guards escort the crazy, jealous sister off the property. She wanted to prove to everyone standing there that I was exactly the bitter, unstable woman she had painted me out to be all these years. My heart was pounding fiercely against my ribs, but I took a slow, deep breath. I thought about the small brass key resting heavily in my suit jacket pocket. I remembered the desperate look in my mother's dying eyes and the cold chill of her final warning. They took the estate. I looked Yvonne right in the eyes and let out a soft, tired sigh. I told her she was absolutely right. I said I had outgrown that childish room a long time ago and that Derek could have it for his gym. I spoke in a calm, defeated tone, making sure the audience heard my complete surrender. I said I would go upstairs right now and start packing my things into boxes so I would not be a burden to her or her husband anymore. Yvonne's triumphant smile faltered for a second. She was clearly confused and disappointed that she did not get the explosive aggressive reaction she had carefully planned for. Derek stepped up next to her, looking slightly suspicious of my easy compliance. But he puffed out his chest anyway and told me that was a very smart decision on my part. He said I should make sure I got all my junk out by 6 o'clock because the contractors were coming tomorrow morning to tear down the walls. I nodded quietly and put my coffee cup down on a nearby table. I turned my back on them and walked away from the crowd, heading straight for the grand staircase in the foyer. The whispers started up again behind me, but I tuned them out completely. Every step I took up those wooden stairs brought me closer to the truth. I walked down the long carpeted hallway past my old childhood bedroom and stopped right in front of the heavy oak doors of my mother's master suite. I glanced over my shoulder to make sure no one had followed me upstairs. The hallway was completely empty. I turned the cool glass knob and slipped inside, closing the door silently behind me. It was time to find the red Bible. The air inside my mother's bedroom was heavy and smelled faintly of her favorite lavender perfume. Everything was perfectly preserved, just the way she had left it before the ambulance took her away 2 weeks ago. Her silk scarves were draped neatly over the vanity chair, and her pearl necklace rested inside an open velvet box on the dresser. I did not have much time. Derek and Yvonne were probably wrapping up their networking downstairs, and they would definitely come looking for me soon to make sure I was actually leaving. I walked straight to the small mahogany nightstand on the right side of her large canopy bed. My mother was a deeply religious woman, and she always kept her Bible close. There it was, a large red leather-bound Bible resting on top of a stack of daily devotionals. I picked it up. It felt heavy, but something about the weight distribution felt slightly off. I ran my fingers along the edges of the thick leather cover and then flipped to the back cover. There was a small hidden zipper completely concealed by a flap of leather binding. I unzipped it carefully, revealing a hollowed-out compartment cut directly into the back cover and several thick pages of the book. Nestled inside the carved space was a small, ornate wooden box. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out and set it on the nightstand. The box had a tiny brass keyhole right in the center of a carved silver cross. I reached into my suit pocket and pulled out the small brass key my mother had pressed into my palm right before she died. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. A soft click echoed in the quiet room. I opened the lid. Inside there was a black USB drive and a thick stack of folded legal documents. I unfolded the papers quickly, scanning the first page. The bold heading at the top sent a sharp jolt of electricity down my spine. It read, "Irrevocable Trust Agreement." The date on the document was from exactly 1 month ago. I read the first paragraph. The grantor was Shirley Thompson, my mother, and the sole trustee and primary beneficiary was Carmen Thompson, me. I scanned further down the page. The trust explicitly placed the family estate, the investment accounts, and the life insurance policies into the trust, completely bypassing the traditional probate process. And most importantly, because it was an irrevocable trust, my mother could not have legally modified it or signed the assets over to Yvonne or Derek without my explicit legal consent. I was still trying to process the massive legal implications of what I was holding when heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway outside. Someone grabbed the doorknob and rattled it violently. A split second later, a loud, aggressive knock hit the solid oak door. It was Derek. He shouted my name through the thick wood, telling me to open the door right now. He said he knew I was in there, and that if I was trying to steal his mother-in-law's jewelry, he was going to have me arrested. Panic flared in my chest. I had seconds to hide the evidence. I shoved the heavy legal documents directly down into the deep inside pocket of my tailored blazer, letting them slide down against the lining so they would not bulk up. I grabbed the black USB drive and slipped it into the small coin pocket of my slacks. I slammed the wooden box shut, shoved it back into the hidden compartment of the Bible, zipped it up and placed the red book perfectly back on top of the devotionals. Derek pounded on the door again, shouting that he was going to break the lock. I took a deep breath, smoothed down my blazer, and walked over to unlock the door. I pulled it open with a calm expression on my face. Derek shoved his way past me immediately, his eyes darting around the room like a paranoid security guard. He walked straight over to my mother's vanity and checked the open velvet box to make sure the pearl necklace was still there. He turned around and glared at me, demanding to know what I was doing snooping around in a dead woman's room. He pointed a thick finger at my face and told me I had absolutely no right to be in here taking inventory of things that belonged to his wife. I crossed my arms over my chest, ignoring the slight crinkle of the legal papers against my ribs. I kept my voice completely flat and monotone. I told him I was simply looking for a small photo album my mother had promised me years ago before I went downstairs to pack up my room. I told him he was being incredibly dramatic and paranoid. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He walked right up to me, invading my personal space. He told me he knew exactly the kind of person I was. He said I came back hoping for a payout, but I was not going to get a single dime out of this house. He pointed at my leather tote bag resting on a nearby chair and ordered me to open it. He said he wanted to make sure I had not stuffed any of Yvonne's rightful inheritance in there. I did not argue. Arguing would only make him more suspicious. I walked over to the chair, picked up my tote bag, and held it wide open for him to inspect. I pulled out my laptop charger, my makeup bag, and a few old receipts. There was absolutely nothing else inside. Derek looked slightly disappointed that he had not caught me red-handed, but he quickly recovered his arrogant posture. He sneered at me and told me to get out of the room and get back to packing my bags. He said he wanted me off the property by sunset. He turned around and marched out of the room, leaving the door wide open behind him so he could watch me walk down the hall. I picked up my bag and walked out of the room, completely calm on the outside. He stood at the top of the stairs, watching me with a smug, satisfied look on his face. He honestly thought he had won. He thought he had successfully intimidated the outcast sister into total submission. He had absolutely no idea that the very documents that were going to destroy his entire life were currently resting right against my heart, hidden safely inside the lining of my jacket. I waited until the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawn of the estate. My bags were packed and loaded into the trunk of my rental car, exactly as I had promised. I pulled out of the long, sweeping driveway without looking back. I drove for about 3 miles before pulling into the empty parking lot of a quiet suburban strip mall. I turned off the engine and locked all the doors. My hands were trembling slightly as I reached into my blazer and pulled out the small black USB drive. I opened my laptop, resting it securely on the steering wheel, and inserted the drive. A small window popped up on the screen, showing a single folder titled Simply Estate Documents. I double-clicked it. Inside, there were hundreds of scanned PDFs, bank statements, and legal forms. My training as a forensic accountant kicked in instantly. I did not feel grief or fear anymore. I felt cold, calculated focus. I was back in my element, tracking the digital footprints of greedy, desperate people. I started organizing the files by date. The most recent documents were a series of bank transfers originating from my mother's primary investment account. I opened the first statement and my stomach dropped. There was a massive wire transfer, exactly $1.5 million, sent just 3 weeks ago. The funds were routed to a commercial holding account. I ran a quick search on the routing number through a public financial database I had access to. The holding account belonged to Horizon Capital Partners, Derek's failing private equity firm. He had drained my mother's life savings to bail out his own sinking ship. But how did he authorize the transfer? I kept digging through the folder until I found a scanned document titled Durable Power of Attorney. I opened it and zoomed in on the signature line. It was supposed to be my mother's signature, but the ink strokes were completely wrong. The slant of the letters was too aggressive and the pressure points were uneven. Someone had traced her signature. And judging by the heavy-handed loop on the letter Y, it was Yvonne. They had forged a power of attorney document to steal $1.5 million. That constituted federal wire fraud and elder financial exploitation. It was a slam-dunk case for any federal prosecutor. Derek was looking at 10 to 20 years in federal prison. I leaned back against the headrest, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I had them. I had all the proof I needed to destroy Derek's career and send both of them away for a very long time. But my mother's words still haunted me. She had whispered that they took the estate. The bank transfer explained the stolen cash. But what about the house? I scrolled further down the list of files. There was an audio file right at the bottom of the folder simply labeled Thursday. It had been modified just 5 days ago while my mother was still conscious in the hospital. I hesitated for a second, feeling a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach. I clicked play and turned up the volume on my laptop speakers. Derek's voice filled the quiet cabin of my rental car. He sounded stressed and impatient. He was pacing back and forth, his leather shoes clicking against a hard floor. He said the bank is threatening to foreclose on the estate by the end of the month, Yvonne. We used the house as collateral for the bridge loan, and now we do not have the liquidity to cover the interest payment. Yvonne's voice chimed in, sharp and annoyed. She said, "Well, what are we supposed to do, Derek? The doctors are saying she could hang on for another 3 weeks. We do not have 3 weeks. If we do not get the death certificate, we cannot trigger the life insurance payout to cover the loan." There was a long, terrible silence on the recording. Then Derek spoke again, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. He told Yvonne they needed to talk to the attending physician. He said they needed to convince the doctor that her quality of life was gone and that she would not want to suffer on the machines any longer. He said if they could just agree to pull the plug early, they could expedite the probate process and save the house from foreclosure before the bank moved in. A sick feeling washed over me. I slapped my hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. My own sister and her husband had actively conspired to end our mother's life prematurely just to secure a life insurance payout and cover up their massive financial fraud. They had essentially planned a murder disguised as medical compassion. The sheer evil of their conversation was suffocating. They did not care about her pain or her dignity. They only cared about saving their own pathetic social status and their stolen money. I sat in the rental car for a long time, just listening to the sound of my own breathing over the hum of the air conditioning. The sheer evil of their conversation was suffocating. I closed the laptop and placed it carefully on the passenger seat. I did not cry, because the time for tears was completely over. Now it was time to let the forensic accountant take the wheel. I drove back to my hotel and spent the entire night preparing my files. I cross-referenced every single bank statement with the forged power of attorney. I built a timeline of Derek's failing investments and how they perfectly aligned with the illegal withdrawals from my mother's accounts. The next morning, the Atlanta sun was beating down hard on the pavement as I pulled up to a sleek glass office building in Buckhead. This was the office of Richard Vance, an attorney who, according to my late-night research, had a history of ethical complaints and a suspiciously close relationship with Derek's private equity firm. I walked into the heavily air-conditioned lobby wearing my sharpest gray suit. My heels clicked with purpose against the marble floor. The receptionist directed me to a large corner conference room at the end of a long hallway. When I walked in, Yvonne and Derek were already sitting at the massive mahogany table. Yvonne was wearing another pristine black designer dress, sipping sparkling water with a look of extreme boredom on her face. Derek looked incredibly relaxed, leaning back in his expensive leather chair with his ankle resting on his knee. Attorney Vance sat at the head of the table, shuffling a stack of thick cream-colored papers. He was a balding man with an expensive watch and a suit that was a little too tight. He did not even look up when I entered, he just motioned vaguely to an empty chair at the far end of the table. I sat down, placing my leather tote bag deliberately on the polished wood in front of me. The room smelled heavily of stale coffee, expensive cologne, and pure arrogance. Attorney Vance cleared his throat loudly and began reading from the document in front of him. He used a massive amount of heavy legal jargon, speaking quickly in a clear attempt to confuse or intimidate anyone who did not understand the law. But I understood every single word he was saying. He stated that this specific document was executed just 2 weeks ago, and that it completely superseded any and all previous wills or estate plans. He read aloud that the entire estate, including the family home, the sprawling property, the vintage cars, and the massive investment accounts totaling roughly $3 million, was to be left exclusively to Yvonne. Vance claimed my mother had cited Yvonne's unwavering dedication and close physical proximity during her final years as the sole reason for this generous decision. Yvonne dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue, nodding solemnly, as if the burden of inheriting this massive wealth was just so incredibly heavy for her to bear. Then Vance slowly turned the page and looked directly at me over the rim of his reading glasses. He lowered his voice to sound slightly sympathetic. He said that my mother had not completely forgotten about her other daughter. He stated that she had left a very specific provision for Carmen Thompson, a one-time cash disbursement of exactly $10,000. But there was a major catch. Vance explained that receiving this money was strictly contingent upon me signing an absolute waiver of rights. I would have to agree in writing never to contest the will, never to sue the estate, and most importantly, never to request an audit of the financial records. If I refused to sign the waiver, I would get absolutely nothing. It was a classic legal gag order, heavily disguised as a final parting gift from a dying mother. Derek leaned forward and picked up a small, crisp piece of paper from the table. It was a cashier's check already printed and made out to my name. He flicked his wrist and tossed the check across the smooth wooden table. It slid all the way down the polished surface and stopped right in front of my folded hands. He smiled that same condescending smirk he wore at the hospital doors. He told me to take the money and be smart. He said it was more than generous considering I had abandoned this family a very long time ago. He told me I could use the $10,000 to pay off my rental car, buy a nice first-class ticket back to Chicago, and maybe even take a vacation. He leaned closer, resting his elbows on the table. He said I should sign the waiver and walk away right now, because if I tried to drag this out in probate court, he would personally ensure that I was bankrupted by legal fees before we even saw a judge. Yvonne chimed in right on cue. She said I should be incredibly grateful that Mother thought of me at all after the terrible way I had treated them over the years. She pushed a heavy silver pen across the table toward me. It rolled slowly, stopping right next to the cashier's check. She told me to just sign the paper so we could all move on and begin the healing process. She said the family had been through enough drama, and it was time for me to finally do the right thing for once in my life. I looked down at the crisp check for $10,000. Then I looked at the heavy silver pen. The room was completely silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. I reached out and picked up the check. Derek smiled widely, leaning back in his chair with a look of absolute victory on his face. He honestly thought he had won. He thought the outcast sister was finally taking her pathetic scraps and running away back to her lonely life. I kept my eyes locked on his arrogant face. A slow, cold smile spread across my lips. I gripped the top and bottom edges of the thick paper and ripped the cashier's check straight down the middle. The sharp sound of tearing paper echoed violently in the quiet conference room. Derek's smug smile vanished instantly. His face dropped in complete shock. Yvonne gasped loudly, gripping the edge of the mahogany table with both hands. Attorney Vance sat up straight, looking genuinely confused. I dropped the two torn pieces of the check onto the polished wood. I told them I would not be signing anything today, or ever again. Before either of them could shout at me or threaten me, I stood up from my chair and walked straight over to the heavy glass door of the conference room. I grabbed the handle and pulled it wide open. Standing right there in the hallway was Miss Loretta, my mother's oldest and most trusted friend, holding a thick leather briefcase. And right beside her stood Mr. Gordon, one of the most ruthless and high-powered trust attorneys in the entire state of Georgia. Mr. Gordon walked into the conference room with a terrifying level of confidence. His expensive tailored suit put Attorney Vance's cheap outfit to absolute shame. Miss Loretta followed closely behind him, giving me a warm, supportive nod before turning a cold, glaring stare toward Yvonne. Yvonne shifted uncomfortably in her seat, looking back and forth between the newcomers and her husband. Derek stood up quickly, demanding to know who these people were and why they were interrupting a private legal meeting. Mr. Gordon did not even look at Derek. He walked straight over to the large mahogany table and unlatched his thick leather briefcase. The metallic click echoed sharply in the quiet room. He pulled out a thick stack of papers bound in a blue legal folder and dropped it right in the center of the table. He introduced himself calmly, stating his name and his position as the senior managing partner at Gordon & Associates. Attorney Vance physically recoiled when he heard the name. He knew exactly who Mr. Gordon was, and he knew he was completely outmatched. Mr. Gordon looked directly at Vance and told him the document he had just read was a completely useless piece of paper. Yvonne gasped and slammed her hands on the table, shouting that it was our mother's final will and testament. Mr. Gordon ignored her outburst and pushed the blue folder across the table until it touched Vance's hands. He told Vance to read the title page. Vance adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, his face draining of all color. He mumbled the words, "irrevocable trust agreement," under his breath. Mr. Gordon nodded slowly. He explained to the room that exactly 30 days ago, Shirley Thompson had established an irrevocable trust, transferring her entire estate, her homes, her vehicles, and all her investment accounts directly into the trust. He stated very clearly that once an asset is placed into an irrevocable trust, it is no longer part of the individual's personal estate. Therefore, the forged will that Vance had just tried to execute had absolutely no legal standing, because Shirley Thompson technically did not own any of those assets when she died. The trust owned them, and the sole trustee with complete absolute control over every single penny was Carmen Thompson. The silence in the room was deafening. I watched Derek's face transform from arrogant confidence to absolute pure terror. He sank back into his chair, his mouth hanging open slightly. The gears in his head were spinning frantically. I knew exactly what he was thinking about. He was thinking about the bridge loan. If Yvonne did not inherit the estate, they did not own the property. And if they did not own the property, Derek could not use the sprawling family home as collateral to stop the bank from foreclosing on his massive debts. His entire fraudulent financial house of cards was collapsing right in front of his eyes. Yvonne looked at Derek, expecting him to do something to fix this. When he did not speak, she started shrieking. She pointed a manicured finger at me, screaming that I had manipulated our sick mother. She claimed I was a thief and that I had brainwashed her into signing away our family legacy. Mr. Gordon calmly interrupted her screaming. He stated that he had personally evaluated Shirley Thompson, along with 2 independent medical professionals, on the day the trust was signed. He had video documentation proving she was completely lucid and acting entirely of her own free will. He looked at Yvonne and said the only fraud happening in this room was the fake will sitting in front of Attorney Vance. Mrs. Loretta stepped forward and looked down at Yvonne with absolute disgust. She told Yvonne that our mother knew everything about their lies and their greed before she passed away. She said Shirley had spent her final weeks crying over the monster her golden child had become. Yvonne shrank back into her chair, covering her face as the weight of Mrs. Loretta's words hit her. Derek suddenly snapped out of his shock. His face turned a violently angry shade of purple. He jumped out of his chair, knocking it backward onto the floor with a loud crash. He slammed his fists onto the mahogany table, leaning across it to glare at me. He started screaming at the top of his lungs. He told me I was not going to get away with this. He threatened to file an emergency injunction by the end of the day and tie this trust up in probate litigation for the next 20 years. He said he had enough money and legal power to sue me into absolute bankruptcy and that I would spend the rest of my miserable life paying lawyers just to defend myself. He called me every terrible name he could think of, spitting his words with pure venom. I let him scream. I sat there completely unbothered, listening to the desperate threats of a cornered animal. The man who had always used his calm, condescending tone to make me feel small was now throwing a massive temper tantrum in the middle of a law office. When he finally ran out of breath and stood there panting, I reached into my leather tote bag. I did not pull out the trust document. I pulled out a single sheet of paper I had printed at the hotel that morning. It was the bank statement showing the massive illegal wire transfer. I placed it carefully on the table right next to the torn pieces of the $10,000 check. I looked up at Derek with a cold, emotionless stare. I reached out and tapped my index finger directly on the highlighted line showing the $1.5 million withdrawal. I kept my voice completely steady and quiet, forcing him to strain to hear me over his own heavy breathing. I told him he should really worry about his garbage private equity firm before he even thought about trying to sue me. Derek's eyes darted from the highlighted bank statement to my face. All the color drained from his skin, leaving him looking pale and completely terrified. He knew I had caught him. He looked at Attorney Vance for help, but Vance was already packing his briefcase, refusing to make eye contact. Yvonne stared at the bank statement, not fully understanding the financial mechanics, but sensing the absolute ruin staring them in the face. Without saying another word, Derek grabbed Yvonne by the arm, dragging her out of the conference room. They did not even look back. They just ran. Mr. Gordon looked at me and nodded in approval. He said the eviction papers were already drafted and that I had the legal right to remove them from the estate immediately. I thanked him and Mrs. Loretta for their help. I told them I was going straight to the house to make sure Derek and Yvonne did not try to strip the property of its valuable assets before they fled. I drove my rental car back toward the sprawling family estate, taking the sharp turns a little faster than usual. My forensic accounting background told me exactly what a desperate man does when he knows his financial fraud is about to be exposed. He liquidates whatever he can carry. Derek was not going to leave empty-handed. When I pulled through the large iron gates of the estate, my suspicions were completely confirmed. Derek's luxury SUV was parked right on the front lawn with the trunk wide open. The front doors of the house were propped open. I parked my car and walked briskly up the brick pathway. Inside the foyer, the house looked like it was being looted. Yvonne was frantically wrapping my mother's expensive silver dining sets in towels and shoving them into large cardboard boxes. Derek was standing on a chair taking down a very rare oil painting that had hung in our living room for 3 decades. They were tearing the legacy apart, trying to salvage anything they could sell. I stood in the doorway and spoke loudly, echoing through the chaotic room. I told them to put the painting down and step away from the boxes. Yvonne jumped, dropping a silver teapot onto the hardwood floor with a loud clatter. Derek froze on the chair, but he did not look panicked anymore. Instead, that familiar, arrogant smirk crept back onto his face. He stepped down from the chair, dusting off his hands. He looked at his expensive watch and smiled. He said he was wondering when I was going to show up. He told me I was making a massive mistake coming back to this house. I told him he had exactly 5 minutes to leave the property before I had him forcefully removed. I said the trust clearly stated that all physical assets inside the home belonged to the estate, and he was currently committing grand larceny. Derek just laughed. A cold, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. He said he did not care about my fake trust document. He told me he had already made a phone call while they were driving back from the law office. Before I could ask him what he meant, red and blue flashing lights reflected off the large glass windows of the living room. The loud wail of a police siren cut through the quiet suburban neighborhood. 2 local police cruisers skidded onto the driveway, parking aggressively right behind my rental car. 4 officers stepped out quickly, unbuckling their holsters and walking toward the open front door with their hands resting firmly on their belts. Derek walked right past me and met the officers at the door. He immediately put on the performance of a lifetime. He looked at the police with wide, panicked eyes, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. He told the officers that I was a disgruntled, estranged sister who had broken into their family home. He claimed I was waving forged legal documents around trying to steal his wife's rightful inheritance. He said I was completely unstable and that he feared for his wife's physical safety. Yvonne did not miss a beat. She collapsed onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, burying her face in her hands. She started sobbing hysterically, crying out that I had ruined our mother's funeral, and now I was trying to make them homeless. She begged the officers to please just get me out of her house so she could mourn her dead mother in peace. The oldest officer walked toward me with a very stern expression. He was a tall white man with a thick mustache, and he looked completely exhausted by the wealthy suburban drama. He stopped a few feet away from me and held up his hand. I tried to speak. I tried to tell him that I was the legal trustee and that I had the paperwork right inside my bag. I told him they were the ones trying to rob the estate. The officer shook his head, cutting me off completely. He said he did not want to hear any excuses. He told me they got a frantic call from a homeowner saying a trespasser was harassing them with fake deeds. He looked at my dark suit and then looked at Derek's expensive casual wear and Yvonne's theatrical tears. He made his decision right then and there, based entirely on their perfect upper-class performance. He took a pair of heavy metal handcuffs off his belt. The metal clinked loudly in the tense silence of the room. He looked me dead in the eyes and used his deepest, most authoritative voice. He ordered me to turn around and put my hands behind my back. I did not resist at all. I knew exactly how this game was played. As a federal investigator, I had worked alongside local law enforcement for many years, and the golden rule was to never argue with an officer who had already made up his mind based on a fabricated story. I slowly turned around, presenting my back to the older officer, and crossed my wrists behind me. The cold, heavy metal of the handcuffs snapped shut around my skin, clicking tightly into place. The officer tightened them just enough to be uncomfortable, reminding me of the physical power he currently held over me. Derek let out a loud, exaggerated sigh of relief, leaning against the wooden doorframe, like an exhausted man who had just survived a terrifying home invasion. Yvonne peeked through her manicured fingers, her fake, theatrical sobs turning into quiet sniffles as she watched me get detained in the middle of our childhood foyer. The officer kept a firm, solid grip on my left arm and started reciting my Miranda rights. Derek immediately stepped forward, trying to take complete control of the scene. He pointed a finger at me and told the officer to make sure they searched my leather bag because I had probably already stuffed some of his wife's expensive family jewelry in there. He said I was a massive flight risk and that they needed to take me down to the county station and book me into a holding cell immediately. The younger officer, who had been standing quietly near the front door, walked over to my leather tote bag resting on a side table preparing to search it, based entirely on Derek's wild accusations. I kept my voice entirely calm and steady, completely void of any panic, fear, or anger. I spoke directly to the older officer, ignoring Derek completely. I told him that before he put me in the back of his police cruiser, he needed to reach into the inside left breast pocket of my gray suit jacket. I told him he would find a small black leather wallet tucked safely inside. I stated very clearly that I was a federal forensic investigator with the Financial Crimes Division, and that the wallet contained my federal badge and my federal identification credentials. The older officer stopped reading me my rights mid-sentence. His firm grip on my arm loosened just a fraction of an inch as uncertainty washed over him. He looked at me, and then looked over at Derek, who was suddenly shifting uncomfortably on his feet. Derek quickly spoke up, his voice slightly higher and much more desperate than before. He told the officer I was lying, and that I was just a desperate, crazy accountant making things up to get out of trouble. The officer completely ignored Derek this time. He turned me slightly and carefully unbuttoned my suit jacket, reaching his large hand into the inside pocket. His fingers brushed against the smooth leather of my badge wallet. He pulled it out and flipped it open. The heavy silver federal shield caught the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. The officer's tired expression instantly shifted from annoyed local authority to genuine professional caution. He looked closely at my photo ID and then looked back at my face, comparing the two images. I told him to call the federal dispatch number printed on the back of the card to verify my active clearance status. I also told him that inside my leather tote bag, the younger officer was currently holding, he would find a certified blue legal folder containing an irrevocable trust document. I told him to read the name of the sole legal trustee and then match it to the name on my federal identification. The older officer handed my badge wallet to his partner and pulled out his shoulder radio. He walked a few steps away toward the open front porch, turning his back to Derek and speaking quietly into the receiver. The static from the radio hissed softly in the quiet room. The younger officer unzipped my tote bag and pulled out the thick blue folder Mr. Gordon had given me at the law office. He opened it and started reading the first page, carefully scanning the legal jargon. The silence in the grand foyer was incredibly thick and suffocating. Yvonne had stopped fake crying entirely. She was sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, staring at the blue folder with wide, terrified eyes. Derek tried to walk over to the younger officer, waving his hands and telling him the document was a forgery and that they needed to confiscate it as a piece of criminal evidence. The younger officer put his hand up, resting his other hand lightly on his heavy utility belt, ordering Derek to step back and remain completely silent. 2 long, agonizing minutes passed before the older officer walked back inside the house. He hooked his radio back onto his belt and let out a very heavy breath. He walked directly over to me, pulling his small handcuff keys from his uniform pocket. He told me dispatch had fully confirmed my federal credentials and my active security clearance. He reached behind my back and inserted the small key into the metal restraints. The cuffs clicked open and fell away from my wrists. I rubbed my arms slowly, bringing them back to my sides to restore the blood circulation. The officer handed my badge wallet back to me and gave me a curt professional nod, apologizing quietly for the unfortunate misunderstanding. Derek started stammering loudly, his face turning a sickly shade of pale gray. He pointed his trembling finger at me and told the cops they could not just let me go because I was trespassing on his private property. The older officer turned his attention completely onto Derek. His voice was no longer polite or accommodating to the wealthy homeowner. He told Derek that his partner had just reviewed the certified trust document and legally confirmed that Carmen Thompson was the sole legal owner of the estate and everything inside it. He pointed a firm, aggressive finger at the half-packed cardboard boxes of antique silver and the expensive oil painting resting against the wall. He told Derek and Yvonne that they were the actual trespassers, and that if they tried to remove a single item from this house, they would be the ones leaving the property in handcuffs charged with grand larceny. Yvonne let out a genuine cry of absolute panic. She stood up from the stairs, looking frantically around the room as if trying to find a secret exit to escape from a terrible nightmare. She grabbed Derek's arm, shaking him and demanding that he do something and call Attorney Vance to fix this mess immediately. But Derek was completely frozen in place. The realization that his massive web of financial lies had completely unraveled was finally hitting him all at once. He had lost the expensive house. He had lost his only collateral to save his failing business. He had openly lied to the police and nearly gotten arrested himself. His arrogant facade shattered entirely, leaving behind a desperate, angry man with absolutely nothing left to lose. Derek let out a primal, screaming roar of pure, unadulterated rage. His face contorted into something incredibly ugly and violent. He completely forgot about the 2 armed police officers standing right next to him in the room. He lunged directly at me, his large hands reaching out wildly to grab my throat. He screamed that I had ruined his entire life and that he was going to kill me. Before he could even take 2 full steps forward, both police officers tackled him aggressively to the hardwood floor. The heavy thud of his body hitting the ground shook the entire foyer. The older officer pressed his knee hard into Derek's lower back, shouting at him to stop resisting, while the younger officer ripped his arms backward to cuff him tightly. Yvonne screamed in absolute terror, backing away against the floral wallpaper. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the pathetic man pinned to the floor. Just as the metal cuffs clicked securely around Derek's wrists, a loud, frantic buzzing sound started coming from his suit jacket pocket. It was his cell phone vibrating uncontrollably against the solid wood floor. The older officer reached into Derek's pocket and pulled the phone out, placing it face up on the floor just out of his reach. The large screen was lit up brightly with dozens of urgent text messages and missed calls from his private equity partners and his banking associates. The preview text on the main screen read in bold letters that all corporate and personal bank accounts had just been completely frozen by federal order. Derek turned his head against the floor, reading the brightly lit screen. His eyes widened in absolute sheer horror as the final nail in his coffin was hammered completely shut. The older officer pulled Derek up from the hardwood floor by his arms. Derek did not even try to fight back anymore. All the arrogant fight had completely left his body the moment he read those urgent text messages about his frozen accounts. The younger officer read him his rights as they marched him out the front door and pushed him into the back of the local police cruiser. Yvonne was left standing in the grand foyer, completely alone and violently shaking. The older officer turned to her with a look of absolute exhaustion. He told her she had exactly 10 minutes to pack a single overnight bag and leave the premises. He warned her that if she tried to take anything of value from the house, she would be joining her husband in a holding cell at the county jail. Yvonne ran up the grand staircase, sobbing hysterically. Exactly 10 minutes later, she walked out the front door carrying a small duffel bag. She did not look at me. She just walked down the long paved driveway in her expensive designer shoes with absolutely nowhere to go. She had to call a rideshare service just to get off the street, because even the luxury cars parked in the garage were legally tied to the trust. I locked the heavy front doors behind her, feeling the quiet emptiness of the massive house finally settle around me. But I knew my sister better than anyone else in the world. A narcissist does not just give up when they lose control of a situation. They simply pivot and find a brand new audience to manipulate. By Thursday afternoon, Yvonne had already formulated her next desperate plan. Since all of Derek's corporate and personal bank accounts were completely frozen by the federal hold, and she had absolutely no legal access to my mother's estate, she was entirely broke. She needed money, and she needed it fast to hire a defense attorney for her husband. So she went to the one place where her theatrical tears had always worked perfectly. She went to the board of elders at her prestigious megachurch in downtown Atlanta. She arranged an emergency closed-door meeting with the head pastor and the church council. She sat in their lavish administrative conference room wearing a modest black dress and cried her eyes out. She spun a masterful web of absolute lies. She told the board that her estranged, jealous sister had suddenly come back to town with heavily forged legal documents. She claimed I had paid off a corrupt lawyer from Chicago to steal their dying mother's inheritance. She told them I had maliciously called the local police to have her innocent husband arrested on false trespassing charges just so I could kick her out onto the street while she was still grieving. She completely leaned into her role as the devout, grieving daughter who was being unfairly persecuted by a bitter sibling. She begged the church elders for their spiritual and financial support. She told them she and Derek were the victims of a massive financial scam orchestrated by me. She pleaded with them to help her start an emergency legal defense fund so they could hire top-tier attorneys to fight the fake trust document and get their family home back. The church board had known Yvonne for years. They had seen her singing in the front row of the choir, leading the youth groups, and projecting the absolute perfect image of a devout Christian wife. They swallowed every single word she said without asking for a single shred of actual evidence. The head pastor immediately agreed to help her. He promised to dedicate the entire upcoming Sunday service to her specific cause, rallying the congregation of over 3,000 wealthy members to donate directly to her legal fund. I was sitting at the massive mahogany dining table in the estate going through the final pages of the financial audit when my cell phone rang. It was Mrs. Loretta. Her voice was tight with deep worry and absolute disgust. She told me she had just gotten out of a volunteer committee meeting at the church. She said Yvonne was actively turning the entire congregation against me. Mrs. Loretta warned me that the church administration was currently printing flyers and setting up special donation bins for the Sunday service. She said Yvonne was telling everyone in the community that I was a dangerous criminal and a fraud, and that she was planning to use the church's massive legal team to come after me on Monday morning. Mrs. Loretta begged me to be very careful because the head pastor had a lot of political influence in the city, and they could easily make things incredibly difficult for me in the local courts if they rallied enough public support. I thanked Mrs. Loretta for the warning and calmly hung up the phone. I sat back in my chair listening to the quiet ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Yvonne actually thought she could use her social status to completely rewrite reality. She thought the local police arresting Derek for simple trespassing was the absolute worst thing that was going to happen to them. She had absolutely no idea the banking freeze was just an automated preliminary hold triggered by my initial fraud alert flags. But local cops and temporary bank holds were not going to be enough to stop a woman who had thousands of blind followers ready to hand her their hard-earned money. I needed to permanently shut down her entire operation. I opened my laptop and pulled up the heavily encrypted email portal for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I created a new, secure zip file. I attached the forged power of attorney documents, the bank wire transfers showing the stolen $1.5 million, and the horrifying audio recording of Derek and Yvonne discussing how to convince the doctor to pull the plug on our mother. I addressed the email directly to the lead special agent of the white-collar crime division in the Atlanta field office, a contact I knew personally from my previous forensic cases. I typed a brief, highly detailed message outlining the exact federal codes they had violated, including wire fraud and felony elder financial abuse. I took one last look at the screen, feeling absolutely no pity for the sister who had spent her entire life trying to destroy me. I reached out and firmly pressed the send button. Sunday morning arrived with a clear blue sky over Atlanta. The parking lot of the massive megachurch was completely packed with luxury vehicles. Inside the sprawling sanctuary, over 3,000 people were seated in the plush theater-style chairs. The stage was massive, bathed in warm professional lighting with huge digital screens flanking either side of the pulpit. The enormous choir had just finished a powerful worship song, and the atmosphere in the room was thick with heavy emotion. The head pastor stepped up to the clear acrylic podium. He spoke in a soft, somber tone, telling the massive congregation that one of their most devoted members was going through an unimaginable trial. He asked for complete silence as he invited Yvonne up to the stage to share her testimony. Yvonne walked up the carpeted steps, looking like the absolute picture of tragic grace. She wore a simple but incredibly expensive pale beige dress that made her look modest and vulnerable. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she held a single white tissue in her trembling hand. The professional cameras zoomed in on her face, broadcasting her manufactured sorrow to the massive screens and the thousands of people watching the live stream online. She took a deep breath, leaning closely into the microphone, and thanked everyone for their prayers during the darkest week of her entire life. She talked about how much she loved our mother and how devastating it was to watch her pass away. She paused perfectly, letting a single tear roll down her cheek. The crowd murmured in deep sympathy. Then she shifted the narrative completely. Her voice took on a brave, shaky tone. She told the congregation that while she was mourning the tragic loss of her mother, she was viciously attacked by her own flesh and blood. She spun a horrific, elaborate tale about her estranged sister who had abandoned the family years ago, only to return with a heart full of greed and malice. She claimed that I had brought forged legal papers to steal their childhood home right out from under them. She twisted the story of the hospital room, claiming that I had barged in and verbally abused our dying mother in her final moments. She told the thousands of listening ears that I had manipulated the local police to falsely arrest her loving husband Derek right in the middle of their living room, simply because he was trying to protect his grieving wife. She painted Derek as a righteous, innocent man who was sitting in a jail cell because of my wicked lies. She said the devil was actively working through her sister to destroy their family legacy and tear down everything their pious mother had built. The congregation gasped in absolute horror. Some people were shaking their heads while others were openly weeping for her. She looked out at the sea of faces and told them that they had been left completely homeless and completely stripped of their finances due to my malicious legal attacks. She said they needed an army of spiritual warriors to stand behind them. The head pastor stepped up beside her, putting a comforting fatherly hand on her shoulder. He took the microphone and told the church that this was exactly why their community existed. He pointed to the massive digital screens where a special donation link suddenly flashed in bold letters alongside a custom text to give phone number. He asked everyone in the building to dig deep into their pockets to fund a massive legal defense for Yvonne and Derek so they could fight back against this terrible injustice. He said God would multiply whatever they gave to help this faithful woman in her time of desperate need. Ushers began walking down the long carpeted aisles carrying large velvet offering buckets. People were crying openly, reaching into their wallets and pulling out their checkbooks. Hundreds of people held up their glowing cell phones, actively sending money to her fraudulent legal fund. Yvonne stood there at the pulpit, soaking in the absolute adoration and the massive financial support of thousands of people. She looked so incredibly smug, hiding behind her tear-soaked tissue. She thought she had completely won. She thought she had outsmarted me and successfully weaponized an entire church community against me. She believed her perfect image would shield her from any real consequences. But she was entirely wrong. Right as the pastor asked the congregation to bow their heads and raise their hands for a special prayer of protection over Yvonne, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the back of the massive sanctuary. The sound was so sharp and unexpected that the pastor stopped speaking mid-sentence. Thousands of heads turned simultaneously toward the back of the room. The massive solid oak doors of the main entrance were pushed wide open, spilling bright morning sunlight into the dimly lit room. The soft background music being played by the church band slowly faded out into complete and utter silence. I walked straight through the center of those heavy doors, stepping onto the plush red carpet of the main center aisle. I was wearing a sharply tailored black suit, my hair pulled back tightly and my heels clicking with absolute authority against the floor. I did not look like an estranged, bitter sister. I looked exactly like the federal investigator I was, but I was not walking alone. Flanking me on both sides, walking in perfect synchronization, were 4 federal agents. They were large, intimidating men wearing dark slacks and crisp navy blue windbreakers. Printed clearly across the back and front of their jackets in bright yellow letters was the acronym FBI. Their heavy metal badges hung on thick chains around their necks, bouncing slightly with every deliberate step they took down the aisle. The entire church froze. The ushers stopped moving the velvet buckets. The people who were crying suddenly held their breath. The only sound in the massive room was the rhythmic clicking of my heels and the heavy footsteps of the federal agents walking beside me. The cameras that were focused on the stage quickly pivoted to capture us broadcasting our entrance onto the massive screens for everyone to see. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the stage. The pastor stood frozen with his hands still resting on Yvonne's shoulder, looking completely bewildered by the sudden federal presence in his sanctuary. But it was Yvonne's reaction that I will remember for the rest of my life. The smug, victorious look on her face vanished in a single instant. All the color violently drained from her skin, leaving her looking like a pale ghost. She dropped her white tissue, and her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She took a step back, bumping into the acrylic podium as she realized that her web of lies had just collided with the absolute unstoppable force of the federal government. The head pastor was a man who was entirely used to having absolute, unquestioned authority inside the walls of his massive building. He quickly recovered from his initial shock and stepped down from the raised acrylic pulpit to intercept us. He held up his hands in a defensive gesture, trying to block the center aisle. He used his deep, booming preaching voice telling the federal agents that this was a sacred space of worship and that they were heavily interrupting a holy moment. He demanded that we turn around and leave his sanctuary, immediately stating that whatever civil dispute was happening could be handled in a private office on Monday morning. He was so incredibly used to wealthy church members bowing to his every command that he actually believed he could tell the FBI to go away. The lead federal agent did not even slow down. He simply kept walking, forcing the head pastor to take several awkward steps backward, just to avoid being physically trampled. The agent reached into the inner pocket of his navy blue windbreaker and pulled out a thick, folded document. He held it up right in front of the pastor's face. The agent spoke in a voice that was completely devoid of any emotion or religious reverence. He stated clearly that he was holding a federal arrest warrant signed by a United States district judge. He said they were here to execute an immediate apprehension for multiple counts of felony wire fraud and federal financial exploitation. He told the pastor that if he continued to block a federal investigation, he would be immediately placed under arrest for obstruction of justice. The pastor swallowed hard, his fake spiritual confidence completely evaporating. He slowly lowered his hands and stepped out of the way, blending back into the edge of the stage. The massive congregation watched in absolute stunned silence. The velvet offering buckets were slowly lowered to the floor by the confused ushers. Thousands of eyes shifted from my face to the federal agents, and finally over to the front row of the VIP section. That was exactly where Derek was sitting. He had been placed in the seat of honor right in the front row reserved for grieving family members and heavy donors. When Derek saw the bright yellow letters on the backs of the agents' jackets, his face turned a sickening shade of gray. He knew exactly what was happening. The local police arresting him for trespassing was a minor inconvenience, but a federal warrant meant his entire fraudulent financial empire had been completely exposed. He looked across the aisle and made direct eye contact with me. I did not look away. I stood perfectly still, letting him see the cold, calculated justice he had brought entirely upon himself. Derek's survival instincts suddenly kicked in, but they were completely fueled by blind, cowardly panic. He did not stand by his wife. He did not try to explain himself. He simply looked frantically toward the side exit door, located just behind the choir loft. The exit sign glowed bright red above the heavy wooden frame. Derek slowly slid out of the cushioned pew, hoping the chaos and confusion in the room would mask his escape. He took 2 slow steps toward the side aisle, and then he broke into a desperate sprint. But federal agents are highly trained to anticipate the panicked flight of white-collar criminals. The moment Derek's shoulder dipped toward the exit, 2 of the agents flanked beside me immediately broke from our tight formation. They moved with terrifying speed and precision. Derek was wearing expensive, smooth-bottomed leather shoes that were absolutely useless on the highly polished hardwood floors of the church. His feet slipped slightly as he tried to round the corner of the choir loft. He forcefully shoved his way past an elderly woman in the choir, causing her to stumble backward into a music stand. He was only 10 feet away from the side exit when the closest federal agent closed the distance. The agent did not hesitate. He lunged forward, dropping his shoulder and driving his entire body weight directly into Derek's lower back. The physical impact was incredibly violent. Both men went flying forward, crashing heavily into a stack of metal folding chairs stored near the wall. The sound of the metal chairs clattering and scraping against the hardwood floor echoed like an explosion through the silent sanctuary. The entire congregation erupted into chaos. People in the front rows jumped out of their seats, screaming and pulling their children close. The camera operators in the back of the room were still rolling, broadcasting the entire brutal takedown live onto the massive digital screens hanging above the stage. Everyone in the building and thousands more watching online saw Derek struggling pathetically on the floor. The federal agent quickly flipped Derek over onto his stomach, pressing a heavy knee firmly between his shoulder blades. Derek let out a sharp cry of pain as his arms were forcefully twisted behind his back. The harsh metallic clicking of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the room, locking his wrists tightly together. The second agent stood over them, with his hand resting cautiously on his holstered weapon, scanning the terrified crowd to ensure no one else tried to interfere. The agent pinning Derek down began reading him his Miranda rights, his strong, authoritative voice carrying perfectly over the panicked murmurs of the church members. Up on the stage, Yvonne watched her entire perfect life shatter into a million irreparable pieces. She looked at her husband pinned to the floor like a common criminal. She looked at the thousands of church members who had just been writing her checks, now pointing at her and whispering in absolute horror. The reality of the situation hit her like a freight train. There was no talking her way out of a federal indictment. There was no amount of fake tears that could undo a recorded audio file detailing a plot to pull the plug on our mother. In that split second, her deep narcissistic self-preservation instinct completely took over. She realized that Derek was a sinking ship, and if she stayed tethered to him, she was going to drown right alongside him. She did not care about her marriage vows. She only cared about saving her own skin. Yvonne lunged forward, gripping the edges of the clear acrylic podium with trembling hands. She leaned so close to the microphone that her breath popped loudly against the speaker system. She looked out at the sea of horrified faces and then pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at her husband, who was currently being dragged to his feet by the federal agents. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that drowned out every other sound in the massive building. She shouted into the microphone that she did not know anything about the stolen money. Her voice cracked with desperate, panicked energy as she told the crowd that Derek was a monster who had completely manipulated her. She screamed that he had tricked our dying mother and forced her to sign those papers. She stood on the stage of the holy sanctuary and completely threw the man she had conspired with right under the bus, sobbing violently and begging the church to believe that she was nothing more than an innocent victim of his wicked financial crimes. Yvonne's frantic screams bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the sanctuary, echoing loudly into the stunned silence of the congregation. Derek, who had just been hauled to his feet by the federal agents, stared at his wife with absolute disbelief. His jaw dropped and his face twisted into a mask of pure betrayal. The man who had orchestrated the entire financial fraud, who had confidently threatened me in a law office just days ago, was now completely unraveled by his own wife's treacherous cowardice. The lead agent read Derek his final Miranda warnings and signaled to his partner. Without another word, they began to physically escort Derek down the carpeted stairs of the stage, leading him toward the side exit. The entire massive church watched in complete shock as one of their most prominent and wealthy members was marched out the door in federal handcuffs. But the performance was not over. Yvonne was still standing behind the acrylic podium, gripping the edges so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She was breathing heavily, trying to control the narrative, trying to salvage the massive fraudulent legal defense fund she had just created. She leaned into the microphone again, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. She cried out that she was just a foolish woman who trusted the wrong man. She begged the church elders and the thousands of people sitting in the pews to forgive her ignorance. She claimed she loved our mother more than anything in the world, and that she would spend the rest of her life trying to atone for Derek's horrible sins. I had heard enough. I stepped out from between the two remaining federal agents who had stayed behind to secure the scene. I walked slowly and deliberately up the carpeted stairs toward the stage. My heels clicked softly against the wood, but the sound was completely amplified by the deafening silence of the massive room. The head pastor took a step forward looking incredibly nervous, but the stern presence of the federal agents kept him firmly rooted to his spot. Yvonne watched me approach, her eyes darting frantically looking for an escape route that did not exist. I reached the acrylic podium. Yvonne tried to block me, shifting her body weight to shield the microphone, but I simply reached out and firmly took it from her trembling hand. I did not shove her. I did not raise my voice. I just stood there radiating absolute calm certainty. I looked out at the thousands of faces staring back at me. The camera operators in the back of the room zoomed in tightly, capturing every single emotion playing across my face. I spoke directly into the microphone, my voice clear and steady, echoing powerfully through the state-of-the-art sound system. I said you did not know anything, Yvonne. I turned slightly to look my sister dead in the eyes. Her face was completely drained of color, and her chest heaved with panicked breaths. I said you just stood in front of 3,000 people and swore you had no idea what your husband was doing. You claimed you loved our mother and that you were an innocent victim of his greed. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I kept my eyes locked entirely on her, watching her fake grief slowly morph into absolute genuine terror. I unlocked the screen and navigated to the secure audio file I had extracted from the USB drive hidden inside the red Bible. I turned the volume on my phone all the way up and pressed the speaker directly against the sensitive head of the church microphone. Derek's voice filled the massive sanctuary, loud and unmistakable. He sounded stressed and impatient, exactly as he had on the recording. The bank is threatening to foreclose on the estate by the end of the month, Yvonne. We used the house as collateral for the bridge loan, and now we do not have the liquidity to cover the interest payment. The entire church froze. The head pastor turned completely pale. People in the front rows leaned forward, their mouths hanging open in shock. Then Yvonne's voice chimed in, sharp and incredibly annoyed, cutting through the silence of the room like a jagged knife. Well, what are we supposed to do, Derek? The doctors are saying she could hang on for another 3 weeks. We do not have 3 weeks. If we do not get the death certificate, we cannot trigger the life insurance payout to cover the loan. I paused the recording for a fraction of a second, letting the sheer horror of her words settle over the massive crowd. The congregation was completely paralyzed, unable to fully process the sheer evil of what they were hearing. I pressed play again. Derek's sinister whisper filled the room. We need to talk to the attending physician. We need to convince the doctor that her quality of life is gone and that she would not want to suffer on the machines any longer. If we can just agree to pull the plug early, we can expedite the probate process and save the house from foreclosure before the bank moves in. I pressed the stop button and lowered my phone. The recording ended, but the horrific reality of the conversation hung heavily in the air. My own sister. The woman who had just spent the last 20 minutes crying over our mother's tragic death had actively conspired to end her life prematurely, just to secure a payout and cover a fraudulent loan. A massive collective gasp echoed through the sanctuary. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated disgust. The elderly woman sitting in the front row, who had been weeping for Yvonne just moments ago, covered her mouth with both hands, shaking her head in absolute disbelief. The ushers, who were still holding the velvet offering buckets filled with donations, slowly placed them on the floor, stepping backward away from the stage as if Yvonne was suddenly radioactive. The silence that followed the gasp was heavier and more suffocating than anything I had ever experienced. The thousands of people sitting in the plush seats stared at the woman standing on the stage, realizing they had been completely played by a sociopathic narcissist who valued her social status over her own mother's life. Yvonne could not handle the sheer crushing weight of 3,000 disgusted stares. Her perfect image, her carefully constructed facade of pious perfection, completely shattered right there on the stage. Her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the floor of the pulpit, curling into a tight ball and burying her face in her hands. She did not fake cry this time. There were no theatrical sobs or dramatic pleas for sympathy. She just let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine of complete defeat. She knew her entire life as she knew it was completely over. She had lost her money, she had lost her husband, and now she had lost the only thing she truly cared about: her pristine public image. The silence inside the massive sanctuary finally broke, and it shattered into a million pieces of absolute chaos. The thousands of people who just moments ago were wiping away sympathetic tears were now standing up from their plush velvet seats in pure outrage. A low, angry rumble started in the back of the room and quickly rolled forward like a dark tidal wave. The elderly women in the front row who had treated Yvonne like a spiritual daughter were physically recoiling from the stage. One woman stood up and threw her crisp white donation envelope directly onto the hardwood floor, stomping her heel onto it in sheer disgust. All across the room, ushers were frantically waving their hands, signaling the audiovisual team in the back to cut the donation links from the massive digital screens. People were staring at their cell phones, furiously tapping the screens to cancel the electronic transfers they had just authorized. The atmosphere in the room shifted completely from holy reverence to toxic betrayal. Yvonne was no longer their golden child or their faithful sister. She was a monster hiding behind the cross. The head pastor, who had stood paralyzed during the audio playback, finally snapped out of his shock. His face was flushed bright red with extreme embarrassment and righteous anger. He realized that he had just used his immense spiritual authority to ask thousands of his devoted followers to fund a federal criminal defense for a woman who conspired to murder her own mother. His reputation was now dangerously tied to her sickening fraud. He stepped forward with heavy, deliberate strides and reached down to grab the microphone from the podium. He did not look at Yvonne, who was still curled into a pathetic ball at his feet. He looked directly out at his congregation. His deep, booming voice returned, but this time it was completely devoid of any warmth or pastoral comfort. He commanded the room to settle down, and the angry shouting slowly subsided into a tense, hostile hum. The pastor spoke with absolute cold finality. He announced to the entire church that darkness had infiltrated their sanctuary today. He pointed down at Yvonne, declaring that she had manipulated their faith, exploited their generosity, and desecrated the memory of her own mother. He stated clearly and loudly that effective immediately, Yvonne was stripped of all her leadership positions, her choir membership, and her standing within the community. He looked at the board of elders sitting in the front rows, and they all nodded in solemn agreement. He publicly excommunicated her on the spot, forbidding her from ever setting foot on the church grounds again. He told the congregation that every single donation would be immediately refunded, and he apologized deeply for allowing a wolf in sheep's clothing to stand at their sacred pulpit. Yvonne covered her ears with her trembling hands, sobbing violently as the only community she ever truly cared about formally banished her into total exile. Down on the main floor, Derek was still in the firm grip of the federal agents. They were actively pushing him toward the heavy wooden exit doors, but the chaotic scene on the stage had caused them to pause for just a moment. Derek had heard every single word of the audio recording playing over the speakers. He had heard his wife scream her fake confession, throwing the entirety of the blame squarely onto his shoulders. The sheer hypocrisy and betrayal completely broke whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left. As the agents began to forcefully march him down the aisle, Derek twisted his upper body violently toward the stage. His face was twisted in an ugly mask of pure hatred. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with desperate rage. He called Yvonne every vile, disgusting name he could think of. He shouted to the entire church that she was the one who came up with the idea to forge the documents. He screamed that she never loved anyone but herself, and that he hoped she rotted in hell for what she did to him. His curses echoed violently off the stained glass windows until the federal agents finally shoved him through the heavy wooden doors, cutting off his pathetic screams as they dragged him out to the waiting government vehicles. The stage was now completely empty, except for Yvonne and me. The pastor had stepped down to consult quietly with the elders, leaving her entirely isolated under the bright stage lights. The congregation was slowly beginning to file out of the building, completely traumatized and utterly disgusted by the entire morning. I stood near the edge of the stage, looking down at the woman who had spent 32 years making me feel like I was completely worthless. She looked absolutely unrecognizable. The pristine designer dress was rumpled and stained with her own tears and makeup. Her perfect hair was a tangled mess around her face. She slowly pushed herself up from the floor, but she did not stand. She stayed on her hands and knees. She looked up at me, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw genuine, absolute desperation in her eyes. There was no arrogance left. There was no golden child superiority. She was completely and totally broken. She began to physically crawl across the carpeted stage toward me, dragging her expensive dress along the floor. She reached out with a trembling hand, stopping just inches from my polished shoes. She looked up at me, her face smeared with black mascara and tears. Her voice was a pathetic, scratchy whisper. She begged me to help her. She sobbed that she had nothing left, that her accounts were frozen and her husband was gone. She pleaded with me to just give her enough cash to hire a basic defense lawyer so she would not have to go to federal prison. She promised she would disappear and never bother me again if I just showed her a tiny bit of mercy. I looked down at her shaking, pathetic form. I thought about my mother lying in that cold hospital bed pressing the small brass key into my hand with her dying breath. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, and the sheer sociopathic greed that had driven my sister to plot a murder for a payout. I felt absolutely no pity. My heart was completely steady and my mind was incredibly clear. I did not smile and I did not gloat. I just looked at her with the cold professional detachment of a forensic accountant analyzing a completely bankrupt account. I did not say a single word. I slowly turned my back to her, stepping away from her trembling, outstretched hand. I walked down the carpeted stairs and headed straight down the center aisle of the church, leaving her sobbing alone on the floor of the ruined sanctuary. The crisp Sunday air felt entirely different as I walked out of the massive church doors, leaving the chaotic ruins of my sister's life far behind me. I got into my rental car and drove back to my hotel in absolute silence. The emotional toll of the morning was incredibly heavy, but the forensic accountant inside me knew that the legal machinery was just beginning to turn. The federal government does not simply arrest someone and let the dust settle. They squeeze. And I knew exactly how a coward like Derek would react when the full crushing weight of the federal justice system was placed squarely on his shoulders. Later that same afternoon, in a bleak, windowless interrogation room at the federal building in downtown Atlanta, Derek was sitting on a cold metal chair. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat from his violent arrest. His tie was gone and his wrists were still red and bruised from the heavy steel handcuffs. Sitting across the scratched metal table from him were the two federal agents who had tackled him in the church. The lead agent opened a thick manila folder and began laying out the physical evidence I had emailed them. He placed the forged power of attorney document right in front of Derek. Then he placed the highlighted bank statements showing the stolen $1.5 million. Finally, he placed a small digital recorder on the table and pressed play, letting Derek's own sinister voice echo off the concrete walls of the interrogation room. Derek stared blindly at the pile of irrefutable evidence. He was completely cornered and he knew it. The lead agent leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He told Derek that he was looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The agent kept his voice perfectly level, explaining that the federal conviction rate was over 95% when they had an audio confession paired with financial documents. Derek swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously around the small gray room. He tried to swallow his pride, asking the agents in a shaky voice if there was any room for a deal if he agreed to plead guilty and save the government the cost of a long drawn-out trial. The second agent let out a harsh laugh. He leaned back in his chair and looked at Derek with absolute disgust. He told Derek that the government did not need his help to secure a conviction because they already had a mountain of evidence. But the agent decided to turn the psychological screws just a little bit tighter. He pulled out his cell phone and pulled up a video file. It was a recording taken by one of the church members just a few hours ago. The agent turned the screen toward Derek and hit play. It was the video of Yvonne standing at the acrylic podium screaming into the microphone and violently throwing Derek under the bus to save herself. Derek watched his wife sob hysterically, claiming he was a manipulative monster who had tricked everyone. He heard her swear before thousands of people that she had absolutely no idea about the stolen money or the forged documents. Watching that video was the absolute breaking point for Derek. The man had lost his business, his house, and his freedom, but watching his wife completely betray him to save her own perfect image was the final devastating blow. His face contorted with a mixture of profound grief and boiling rage. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He slammed his clenched fist onto the metal table, making the agents jump slightly. He told the agents that he wanted his lawyer present immediately. He said he was ready to tell them absolutely everything, but only if they agreed to a formal plea deal. He looked the lead agent dead in the eyes and promised to give them a piece of evidence so incredibly dark and horrifying that it would guarantee his wife spent the rest of her miserable life rotting in a concrete cell right alongside him. 2 hours later, an aggressive defense attorney was sitting next to Derek, reviewing the terms of a preliminary cooperation agreement. The federal prosecutors were listening closely via a hidden speaker in the corner of the room. The lead agent told Derek to start talking and reminded him that if he lied about a single detail, the entire deal was completely off the table. Derek took a deep, shuddering breath. He looked down at his shaking hands. He told the agents that the audio recording from the hospital was not the beginning of their plan. It was just the panic at the very end. He explained that the pressure from his failing private equity firm had reached a critical boiling point weeks before our mother ever ended up in the intensive care unit. The bank was threatening to foreclose on the massive family estate, and they desperately needed the life insurance money to pay the ballooning interest rates. He said Yvonne was the one who managed our mother's daily medical care and dispensed her prescription pills every single morning. Derek confessed that 3 days before our mother suffered her massive catastrophic stroke, Yvonne had intentionally stopped giving her the required blood pressure and heart medications. He said Yvonne knew exactly how fragile our mother's cardiovascular system was. He told the horrified federal agents that his wife had purposely hidden the vital pill bottles in the back of her own bathroom cabinet, deliberately waiting for our mother's blood pressure to spike to a fatal level. He said Yvonne did it because the bank deadline was rapidly approaching and she could not afford to wait for nature to take its slow, natural course. The interrogation room fell into a deathly silent stillness. The two hardened federal agents stared at Derek, trying to fully process the sheer magnitude of the pure evil they had just uncovered. This was no longer a simple case of white-collar financial fraud or signature forgery. This was a calculated, premeditated act of violence against a vulnerable elderly woman. It was a systematic execution carried out by a daughter who simply wanted to clear a bank loan to maintain her lavish lifestyle. The lead agent stood up from the metal table, his chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. He did not say a single word to Derek. He simply walked out of the heavy steel door of the interrogation room, pulling his cell phone from his pocket. He walked down the quiet federal hallway and immediately dialed the direct emergency line for the local district attorney and the Major Crimes Homicide Division. He explained the horrific confession he had just recorded on tape. Within 20 minutes, the local magistrate's office had drafted and officially signed a brand new set of paperwork. The detectives officially issued an immediate no-bail arrest warrant for Yvonne for severe elder endangerment and being an active accessory to federal wire fraud. 2 days after the federal arrests, the air inside the massive family estate felt entirely different. The suffocating tension that had always lived inside the walls was completely gone, leaving behind a quiet, hollow echo. I hired a professional estate clearing crew to help me empty the sprawling brick colonial. The house was entirely too large, and it held absolutely no warm memories for me. We started the clearing process on the second floor in the master suite. My mother had kept the room perfectly organized, but Yvonne had already started moving her own expensive wardrobe into the massive walk-in closet. She had clearly planned to take over the house the moment the ink dried on the forged will. I told the clearing crew to focus on the heavy furniture and to leave Yvonne's personal belongings entirely to me. I walked into the kitchen and grabbed a thick box of heavy-duty black construction trash bags. I carried them upstairs and walked right into the center of the massive closet. Yvonne's expensive clothes were hung perfectly by color. She had rows of custom-tailored silk dresses, thick cashmere sweaters, and imported leather jackets. Her designer shoes were lined up neatly on the polished wooden shelves. I unrolled a large black plastic bag and snapped it open. I did not bother taking the clothes off the velvet hangers. I just grabbed them by the handful and shoved them violently into the dark plastic bags. I felt absolutely no guilt as I tossed thousands of dollars of her carefully curated image into the garbage. I threw her expensive leather handbags and her silk scarves right on top of the crumpled dresses. I did not fold a single item. It was a necessary physical purge of her toxic presence in this house. Her entire life was built on the illusion of wealth and superiority, and now it was all being stuffed into black trash bags. I tied the tops of the heavy bags into tight knots and dragged them one by one down the grand carpeted staircase. I left the massive pile of black bags right by the front door, leaving specific instructions for the crew to load them into the donation truck destined for a local women and children shelter. As I was dragging the last heavy bag across the hardwood floor, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my suit pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. The news of the dramatic federal arrests at the megachurch and the horrifying details of my mother's death had spread through the family grapevine like absolute wildfire. Suddenly, the outcast sister who was mocked and completely belittled at the repast dinner was the most popular person in the family. Everyone knew that I was the sole legal trustee and the only person with access to the massive family fortune. The first text message was a long, rambling paragraph from Aunt Valerie. This was the exact same woman who had scoffed at me and told me to be grateful that Yvonne was even letting me stay for dinner. Her message was incredibly long and filled with fake religious apologies. She wrote that she always knew Derek was a bad influence and that she was praying for my healing. Then she casually shifted the conversation, mentioning that she was currently 2 months behind on her mortgage. She asked if I could authorize a small emergency loan from the estate just to help out her side of the family in a time of desperate need. I stared at the glowing screen, letting out a soft, dry laugh that echoed in the empty hallway. I pressed the red block button without typing a single word in reply. 5 minutes later, a text came through from my cousin Marcus. He was the one who had loudly agreed with Valerie, calling me selfish for abandoning the family. His message was sickeningly sweet. He told me how proud my mother would be of my incredible strength and asked if my financial investigation firm in Chicago was currently hiring, because he really needed a fresh start. I blocked his number immediately. My phone continued to buzz relentlessly throughout the entire afternoon, with desperate messages from distant cousins and former church elders. They all offered fake condolences, quickly followed by thinly veiled requests for cash investments or business loans. I sat down on the bottom step of the grand staircase and systematically blocked every single one of them. I severed the rotten, greedy branches of my family tree one by one until my phone was finally completely silent. By late afternoon, the massive estate was entirely empty. The expensive antique furniture, the rare silver dining sets, and the expensive oil paintings were all carefully packed into large moving trucks, headed for a high-end auction house in downtown Atlanta. Every single penny from the auction sales would go directly into the irrevocable trust. The empty rooms echoed loudly with my footsteps as I walked through the house one last time. I stopped in the center of the grand foyer, right where Derek had been tackled by the federal agents and where Yvonne had cried her fake theatrical tears. The sharp sound of the doorbell pulled me from my thoughts. I pulled open the heavy wooden front door to find Mr. Gordon standing on the porch. Standing right next to him was a kind-looking woman with short silver hair holding a leather binder. Mr. Gordon introduced her as Eleanor, the regional director of a prominent nonprofit organization that provided safe emergency housing and free legal resources for victims of elder abuse and domestic financial exploitation. We walked inside, and Mr. Gordon placed a thick stack of legal documents on the small folding table we had left in the center of the empty foyer. He handed me a heavy silver fountain pen. I looked down at the documents. It was the final property transfer deed. I was officially selling the sprawling $3 million generational home and the surrounding property to the nonprofit organization for the exact price of $1. Eleanor looked at me with tears welling up in her kind eyes. She thanked me profusely, telling me that this massive donation would allow them to build a specialized sanctuary that would literally save hundreds of vulnerable lives across the state. I smiled genuinely for the first time in what felt like years. I looked around the empty walls of the grand foyer. I told Eleanor that this house had been built on the hollow illusion of a perfect family, but now it was finally going to be used to protect real people who desperately needed a safe place to heal. I uncapped the silver pen and signed my name on the dotted line. The ink flowed smoothly across the thick paper. With a few simple strokes of a pen, I completely erased the toxic physical legacy that my family had fought, lied, and killed for. 2 weeks after I signed the estate over to the charity organization, I found myself driving down a desolate stretch of highway toward the Fulton County Jail. The bright Atlanta sun was hidden behind a thick layer of gray clouds, casting a dull, depressing light over the massive concrete compound. The facility was surrounded by towering chain-link fences topped with thick coils of razor wire. It was a bleak, unforgiving place, designed to strip away every single ounce of human dignity. I parked my rental car in the cracked asphalt lot and walked toward the heavily fortified visitor entrance. I did not want to be here. I had no lingering desire to gloat or rub my victory in my sister's face. But there was one final piece of business I needed to handle before I could completely close this dark chapter of my life and fly back to Chicago. I walked through the metal detectors and handed my identification to a tired-looking guard behind thick, bulletproof glass. The waiting room smelled intensely of industrial bleach, stale sweat, and deep human despair. I sat on a hard plastic chair for nearly an hour, waiting for my approved visitation slot. Finally, a heavy steel door buzzed loudly, and a guard escorted me down a long, fluorescent-lit hallway into the secure visitation block. I walked into a small, sterile booth and sat down on a cold metal stool. A thick panel of smudged plexiglass separated me from the inmate's side. I waited in the quiet booth, staring at the empty metal chair on the other side of the glass. A few minutes later, a heavy door clanked open on the inmate's side. A female guard walked in, leading an inmate by the arm. It took me a few seconds to even recognize the woman sitting down on the other side of the glass. It was Yvonne, but she looked absolutely nothing like the glamorous church elite who had tried to destroy me. The pristine designer dresses were gone, replaced by a baggy, faded orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on her shrinking frame. Her perfect manicured nails were bitten down to the raw quick. But the most shocking change was her hair. The stress of the federal indictment, the absolute loss of her wealth, and the terrifying reality of prison life had caused her hair to fall out in massive clumps. Instead of dealing with the patchy bald spots, she had completely shaved her head. Without her expensive weaves, her perfect makeup, and her designer clothes, she looked incredibly small, fragile, and completely ordinary. She sat down heavily on the metal stool and picked up the black plastic telephone receiver. Her hands were trembling violently. I picked up the receiver on my side and held it to my ear. The line crackled with harsh static before her voice filtered through. I expected her to be completely broken. I expected genuine remorse or at least a quiet, defeated silence. But a narcissist never truly surrenders their alternate reality, even when they are locked inside a concrete cage. The very first words out of her mouth were an angry, bitter complaint about the terrible jail food. She did not say hello. She did not apologize. She immediately launched into a frantic, breathless monologue about how entirely unfair her life had become. She told me the guards were treating her like an animal, and that the other inmates were terrifying. She leaned closer to the scratched glass, her dark, sunken eyes glaring at me. She told me I needed to fix this immediately. She said she knew I had access to the trust money now, and that I needed to hire her a high-powered defense team to fight the federal prosecutors. She claimed Derek was the one who forced her to do everything, and that she was completely innocent. She cried dry, pathetic tears, demanding that I drop the charges and tell the FBI it was all a massive misunderstanding. I just sat there holding the heavy plastic receiver to my ear, listening to her spin her endless web of absolute delusions. I did not interrupt her. I did not argue with her or point out the massive logical flaws in her demands. I just watched her mouth move, taking in the sheer sociopathic entitlement of a woman who was facing decades in federal prison for elder abuse and wire fraud, yet still believed she was the ultimate victim of the universe. When I did not immediately respond to her demands, she started getting angry. Her voice pitched higher, echoing harshly through the cheap plastic speaker. She pounded her fist weakly against the bulletproof glass. She told me I was a horrible, bitter sister. She said I was just doing this to punish her because I was always jealous of her. Then she played her ultimate trump card, the one she had used to manipulate me our entire lives. She invoked our mother's name. She told me that mother would be absolutely disgusted with me for leaving her favorite daughter in a place like this. She said mother loved her the most and that mother always wanted her to have the best of everything. She claimed our mother would have gladly given her the money if she had just asked, and that putting her in prison was an insult to our mother's pristine legacy. She finally stopped talking, breathing heavily and staring at me with wild, desperate eyes. She was waiting for me to engage. She was waiting for the familiar argument, the defensive posture I used to take when we were younger. But I was no longer that wounded little girl desperately seeking validation. I kept my face completely emotionless. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single piece of folded paper. It was not a legal document or a bank statement. It was the final page I had carefully torn from the back of the red leather Bible I found in my mother's master suite. It was a hidden journal entry my mother had written just days before her fatal stroke. I slowly unfolded the thick paper. The ink was slightly smudged from where my mother's trembling hands had dragged across the page, but her cursive handwriting was unmistakable. I did not read it out loud to her. I simply pressed the flat piece of paper directly against the smudged bulletproof glass facing inward so Yvonne could read it perfectly. Yvonne stopped breathing. Her dark eyes darted down to the familiar handwriting. I watched her lips move silently as she read the short paragraph my mother had written in her final days of clarity. The entry was completely devastating in its honesty. My mother had written that she knew the end was coming, and that her biggest regret was not the money or the estate. Her biggest regret was her children. The words on the page were painfully clear. It read, "Carmen was always strong and independent, and I punished her for it because I could not control her." Yvonne, I am so sorry. I am sorry I gave you everything you ever wanted. I am sorry I never told you no. I enabled you into becoming a useless, greedy monster. And now I am completely terrified of the daughter I created. I watched the exact moment Yvonne's soul completely shattered. Her dark eyes widened in absolute sheer horror as her brain processed the heavy, undeniable truth written in our mother's own hand. For 36 years, Yvonne had built her entire identity on the unshakable belief that she was the golden child, the perfect angel, who was infinitely loved and deeply admired by the woman who gave us life. She believed her mother's favoritism was a reward for her perfection. But the letter completely destroyed that delusion. She was not loved. She was pitied. She was a massive, deeply regretted mistake. Our mother did not view her as a successful, beautiful woman. Our mother viewed her as a pathetic, greedy monster created by her own toxic enabling. The realization that her entire life was built on a foundation of profound pity and regret hit Yvonne harder than the federal indictment ever could. The ultimate psychological blow bypassed her legal fears and struck directly at the core of her deeply narcissistic identity. Yvonne's hands began to shake so violently that the black plastic telephone receiver slipped from her grip and slammed against the metal counter. She did not try to pick it up. She pressed both of her hands against the bulletproof glass, her face twisting into an agonizing mask of pure psychological torment. She let out a silent, screaming sob, opening her mouth wide as heavy, thick tears finally poured down her hollow cheeks. She slid slowly off the metal stool, collapsing onto the dirty concrete floor of the visitation booth. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her bald head and rocking back and forth in absolute, complete devastation. I looked through the glass at the pathetic, ruined woman on the floor. I felt the final heavy weight of my traumatic childhood completely lift from my shoulders. The ghosts of that house, the expectations, and the bitter cruelty could no longer touch me. I reached out and gently placed the heavy plastic receiver back onto its metal hook, cutting off the sound of her muffled screams. I folded the piece of paper, slipped it back into my suit pocket, and turned around. I walked out of the visitation block, out through the heavy steel security doors, and straight into the bright fresh air of my new life, never looking back again. 6 months later, I sat in the back row of a heavy oak-paneled federal courtroom in downtown Atlanta, watching the final chapter of my family's dark saga officially come to a close. The air in the room was stale and heavy with the absolute gravity of the federal justice system. Derek had spent a small fortune trying to fight the federal charges, hoping his high-priced defense attorneys could find a legal loophole to save him. But his own audio recordings and the massive, undeniable paper trail of wire fraud left his legal team with absolutely nothing to work with. The federal judge was a stern, uncompromising woman with zero tolerance for privileged white-collar criminals who exploited the elderly for personal financial gain. She looked down at Derek from her high bench and delivered a scathing reprimand before handing down a massive sentence. Derek received 20 hard years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. When the heavy-set bailiff led him away in his bright orange jumpsuit, the arrogant private equity manager was completely gone. He did not look smug, and he did not make any threats. His shoulders were slumped, and he looked completely hollowed out by the terrifying reality of his new life behind concrete walls. Yvonne, on the other hand, had taken a desperate plea deal the exact moment she realized Derek had completely flipped on her in the interrogation room. She pleaded guilty to accessory to wire fraud and felony elder endangerment, hoping to avoid a long public trial. Standing before the judge, she tried to muster one last theatrical cry for sympathy, begging for leniency because she was a grieving daughter. But the judge cut her off completely, reminding her that her fake tears could not wash away the audio evidence of her plotting to end her mother's life. Yvonne was sentenced to 10 long years in a federal women's correctional facility. As the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut behind her, I felt the last remaining invisible chain that bound me to their toxic world finally snap and fall away forever. I walked out of the federal courthouse, packed my bags at the hotel, and took the very first flight back home to Chicago. Walking into my own quiet apartment high above the busy city streets, I felt a profound sense of absolute peace that I had never truly known before. The air inside my home felt lighter, and the quiet isolation that used to bother me on lonely nights now felt like a warm, protective blanket. I went back to my firm and threw myself into my accounting work. But my fundamental perspective as a forensic accountant had completely shifted. I no longer wanted to just audit massive corporate accounts or track down hidden offshore funds for wealthy corporate clients. I wanted to use my highly specific set of skills to protect the people who could not protect themselves against the predators in their own families. 3 months after returning to Chicago, I used a significant portion of the auction funds from the sale of the Atlanta estate to establish a specialized nonprofit legal organization. I named it the Shirley Thompson Elder Defense Fund, honoring the final brave choice my mother made on her deathbed. We hired top-tier legal investigators and brilliant financial analysts, entirely dedicated to tracking down greedy family members and abusive caretakers who were actively exploiting vulnerable seniors. We provided entirely free legal representation and forensic auditing to victims of elder fraud, making sure no other mother or father would ever have to lie in a hospital bed, terrified that their lifelong legacy was being stolen by the very people they trusted the most. Channeling my profound grief and anger into a protective shield for others became the ultimate healing process for my own shattered heart. A full year after the chaotic, dramatic events at the Atlanta megachurch, I flew back down south one final time. The brutal, suffocating southern summer had finally faded into a crisp, cool autumn morning. I rented a car at the airport and drove out to the quiet, sprawling green cemetery on the quiet outskirts of the city. The rolling hills were covered in bright orange and yellow leaves blowing gently in the soft morning breeze. I walked slowly down the long, perfectly manicured gravel paths until I found the simple, elegant granite headstone with my mother's name carved deeply into the polished stone. I stood there for a very long time, just listening to the wind rustling through the old oak trees above me. I realized that I did not feel the heavy, crushing resentment that used to choke me every single time I thought about her. The burning anger was completely gone. In its place was a quiet, deep understanding of a tragic life. She was a deeply flawed woman who made terrible choices out of her own insecurities and her desperate lifelong need for shallow social validation. She paid the ultimate horrifying price for the greedy monster she created in Yvonne. But in her absolute final moments, she had finally chosen the truth. She had finally chosen to protect me. I knelt down on the soft, damp grass and placed a single white rose at the base of the heavy headstone. I traced my fingers slowly over the cold carved letters of her name. I whispered softly into the wind that the massive house was gone, the money was legally secured, and the dark truth was finally out in the open for everyone to see. I told her that she could finally rest in peace because her outcast daughter was going to be absolutely fine. I stood up, took one last deep breath of the crisp, clean autumn air, and walked back toward my rental car. I left the silent cemetery feeling incredibly light, completely ready to embrace the beautiful, peaceful life I had fought so hard to build for myself. Thank you so much for listening to my story, all the way to the very end. Navigating a deeply toxic family dynamic is without a doubt one of the most painful, confusing, and isolating experiences a person can ever go through in their lifetime. Society constantly tells us that blood is thicker than water and that we must always forgive our toxic family members, no matter how horribly they betray or abuse us. But my long, painful journey taught me that true, genuine family is built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, unwavering honesty, and unconditional love. It is definitely not built on shared DNA or the heavy, suffocating obligation to keep dark secrets just to maintain a fake, perfect public image for the neighborhood or the church. Sometimes the absolute healthiest and bravest thing you can possibly do for your own mental and physical survival is to walk away entirely from the people who share your last name and build a beautiful, supportive, chosen family of your own. Have you ever had to draw a hard line in the sand and set strict permanent boundaries with a toxic family member just to protect your own inner peace? How did you finally find the courage to walk away when the external pressure to stay and keep quiet was absolutely overwhelming? Please share your own personal stories and experiences in the comments section below, because your specific journey might be exactly what someone else in the dark desperately needs to hear today. If my story resonated with you or helped you find clarity in any way, please hit the like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more true stories about overcoming severe family trauma, finding your own powerful voice, and building a life of absolute genuine peace. Remember that your personal worth is never determined by the broken people who completely failed to appreciate you. And it is absolutely never too late to start writing a brand new beautiful chapter of your own amazing life.